Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, That Model Railway Guy, and welcome to another layout update on the modular model railway. As you can see, I've got the yard module out today, and you may remember from a couple of episodes ago, I laid all the track on both this module and then also the station module that goes beyond it. There was, however, one section of track that I didn't put down, and that was the inspection pit. The inspection pit is going to go just here. You can see that there's a little bit of temporary track that I've just sort of put in there. That was an offcut that was about the right length, and so I just clipped it in there just so I knew where the inspection pit was going to go. But I haven't laid any of the cork or drilled the hole for the inspection pit itself, so that's what we're going to focus on today. The reason that I didn't do the inspection pit originally was because I just wanted to focus on getting the majority of the track down, making sure it was working and was all wired up correctly, and then I could spend a bit more time worrying about the inspection pit in the future. The future is now though, so we're going to do the inspection pit today, and I've got the Peco inspection pit kit, and what I'm going to do with that is build it, then paint it, and then hopefully install it on the layout. The reason I'm going to paint it after I've built it, but then before I've installed it, is because I'm not very good at doing all the painting and stuff. And so I find it much easier to do when I can kind of hold it and look at it from different angles and get the brush in properly. That's more difficult to do when the inspection pit is actually going to be installed on the layout. So I figured I'd build the kit, paint it, and then try and install it. So yeah, I think that's everything. Let's actually go build the kit, shall we? So this is the kit, and it's mostly made up of these individual sections that you join together to make the pit as long as you want. There's 6 in the pack, but in this instance I'm only using 4, so I'll have a couple left over. Assembling the kit is actually pretty straightforward. First, I just remove the excess plastic on each of the sections. And when that's done, they simply clip together, so I permanently joined them by adding a bit of glue onto the lugs and then pushing the parts together. With the assembly complete, it's now time to paint everything, and I didn't really have a plan here other than I wanted it to look really mucky and dirty, so I basically gave the entire pit a coat of dark grey that I had going spare. Of course, as soon as I started doing this, I realised I hadn't put the steps in place, so I added a bit of glue to the bottom of these before pushing them down into the pit at either end. And then I carried on painting. The paint was quite thick, so I thinned it down a bit, and this actually had a great effect of varying the colour. In some areas where the paint was thinner, it mixed with the original tan colour of the plastic, so rather than just being one solid colour, it looked more like patchy dirt that had built up over the years. Next, a bit of a time-consuming step was painting all the chairs in a rust colour. Even though this takes a long time, I do think it makes a big difference. When that was done, I decided to give the whole pit a wash of black, again just to add another layer of dirt and grime. It looks quite drastic when you first put it on, but as the paint thins and spreads out, it turns into a more subtle effect and picks out some of the detail. And you can also see here another detail I picked out was the drains on the floor of the pit. While that was all drying, I then painted the walkways that go across the pit, and for this I started off with a lighter grey. You'll also notice that I've kept the walkways attached to the sprue, which I found made painting much easier as they are quite small parts. And then when the light grey was done, I dry brushed on some brown just to break them down a bit. And you can see this nicely brings out the texture detail on the surface. The last step was to add some soot to the bottom of the pit, and for this I used a Peco coal dust weathering powder. All I did was spread some watered down PVA along the floor of the pit, and then sprinkled the dust on top of it. And then I also used the brush again to clump it up a bit so it didn't look too neat. And here you can see this is what the finished pit looks like before it's installed. Now that the coal dust has dried at the bottom, I'm really pleased with how this effect has come out. I actually got this idea from looking at a real inspection pit the other day at a heritage railway, and it made me realise just how dirty these pits can get. So now it's time to actually fit this to the layout, and that is going to be easier said than done. You might just be able to see that there are 2 pencil marks that run across the entire board, and that denotes where underneath there is a piece of wood that is part of the framing that sort of braces the whole board together. Unfortunately, that piece of wood is right where I want the inspection pit to start, and so if I was to cut the hole, I would then have to cut away part of that framing, and I don't really want to have to do that. So my solution to this is really quite simple, and that's just to move the inspection pit up by a few centimetres. That's really all it is. Thankfully, it's not right in the middle of it, it's at one end, so yeah, instead of the inspection pit starting here, it will just start like here instead. So I think we can get away with that, and actually it means that we get a nice little bit of a run-in from the point here to the inspection pit, rather than the inspection pit just starting straight off the point. So I think that'll be a bit more realistic as well. So next thing we're going to do is mark out exactly where I want the inspection pit to go, and then cut the hole and hopefully fit it all in place. So let's get to that now. The first thing I did was to mark roughly where the rails would be. Then inside those lines I marked out a box which would be the hole I needed to cut for the actual pit. And then with everything marked out, I started by drilling a hole at each end. These holes then allowed me to get the jigsaw in so that I could cut a slot out more easily. And as you can see, cutting with the jigsaw was a very quick process. And just like that, the majority of the slot was cut. Now I just needed to tidy it all up with a file, especially at the ends where there was still quite a bit of excess wood. This was probably the longest part of the process, as I was quite conservative when cutting out the slot. I didn't want it to be too wide, but that meant it was a bit of a tight fit in some areas, so I did have to sand it back. Still, I'd rather it was that way round, rather than having taken too much off and not being able to put it back on. With everything cleaned up, I was then able to test fit the inspection pit, and surprise surprise, it actually worked. Of course, as the rest of my track is laid onto a layer of cork, I'd have to bring the top of the pit up to this level too. First, I filled the gap between the end of the point and the start of the pit with an offcut of cork underlay. And in this instance, I actually used super glue to stick it down, as it was a fairly small amount, and also because I was working quickly. And then for the pit itself, I cut a small strip of cork on either side of the slot so that when the pit rests on it, the rails are then at the same level as the rest of my track work. With the cork glued down and the pit installed, it was time to thread the rails through. Now the kit actually comes with some rail that I could have used if I wanted to, however you can see here that they're not that long, so I'd have to join multiple rails together. Instead, I'd much rather have a single piece of track, as that feels a bit more reliable to me and is less likely to cause problems in the future. So I took a bit of flexible track that I'd cut to the length of the entire siding, and I cut out a section of sleepers that was the same length as the pit. And then once I'd removed most of the sleepers, I very slowly started to thread the rails through the chairs on the pit. And then once I was all the way through, I was able to connect it up to the point that leads to the siding. That said, I didn't want to waste the rails that came with the kit, but I managed to find a great use for them. I started off by painting the entire rail in a brown colour. I'm using Rail Match Sleeper Grime here, which is generally what I use on the rail sides on my layout. And I'm covering the entire rail here. It's not going to be used to run locos on, so I don't need to keep the tops nice and shiny in this instance. And when the brown is on, I then dry brush a rust colour over the top of that. This is light rust, which again is another rail match paint. And I just want little patches of rust here and there that blends in nicely with the brown undercoat. With the rails painted up, I then put them between the tracks on my other layout, Pickwick Yard. Here you can see they just look like some old discarded rails that have been replaced at some point and left by the side of the track. It's just a nice detail that works really well on my rundown shunting layout, and it's something I think I'll repeat on the modular layout too, although there's a long way to go before I get to that stage. Getting back to the modular layout though, you can see that the inspection pit is now fully installed. You'll notice I've also painted the rail sides on here too. I didn't do this on camera though, as it was quite fiddly and took me ages, as I didn't want to spoil the paint job I'd done on the rest of the pit. You do have to paint the rails once they're in position though, as if you try to paint them before and then push them through, it'll scrape all of the paint off. Don't ask me how I know that. Finally, I've also added a buffer stop to the end of the siding, which is another Peco kit that I've upgraded slightly. I've actually done a tutorial on this too, so click the link at the top right of the video now if you're interested in having a look at that. And so that is the inspection pit complete, and I'm actually really happy with how this has turned out. And of course it'll look much better as well once I've got the rest of the scenery in place too and it all blends together. Now, because these pits are built up sort of out of little segments, I did have a couple of those left over, and so what I decided to do with those is I put a small inspection pit in the shed. And in fact, if I just move the shed out of the way, you can see that there is a cheeky Peckett hiding in there, but just in front of it on this road here, we've got another very short inspection pit. I don't think they would have bothered to dig one this short in real life, but the way I'm justifying it is that I put it right in the doorway of the shed, so you can only really see it when you get down low and look into the shed. But hopefully when you do that, you'll only be able to see the very front of it, and if there's a loco sat on the other half of it, you won't notice that it doesn't actually run back for the entire length of the shed. Now, we have the Peckett sat there, so I think the only thing left to do is a bit of testing to make sure everything still works, which it should do, but it's always good to test. So let's get the Peckett running, and hopefully everything will be nice and smooth. And as you can see, this is onto the new section of track now, and everything is working perfectly. We'll just stop it up by the buffers. I'll just flip these points and then we can test the second pit as well. So I'll get it running in reverse. And because this is all one section of track, the continuity should be good, and so it should be nice and reliable. And that's the same for the second one as well. So we'll just try it now, see if it'll make it over the pit without any problems. And there we go, no issues at all. That's fantastic. I'll just slow it down and we'll just stop it over the pit as well. There we go. So that's a job well done, I think. Thank you so much for watching, everybody. I do hope you've enjoyed this episode. And if you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment, and don't forget to hit that bell icon as well to get notifications, especially if you want to keep up to date with all the progress I'm making on the modular model railway. There's new stuff happening all the time, and the next episode in this series is going to be really exciting. I've started filming it already, and it's a big one. That's all I'll say. Anyway, again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!